Three young men walked into a diner and publicly mocked a quiet veteran. But when the truth came out, they were the ones begging for forgiveness. The morning sun had just started warming the streets of Bakersfield, California. Lou's diner sat at the corner of 19th and H, tucked between a run-down laundromat and a shuttered hardware store. The sign outside flickered from time to time, but nobody minded. They weren't coming for ambiance. They came because it felt like home. Inside, the place smelled like bacon grease and fresh biscuits. Booth seats were torn in places, patched with duct tape. The walls had old newspaper clippings, sun-faded pictures of local high school football teams from decades past, and a crooked American flag near the counter. It wasn't pretty, but it was familiar. And every Sunday, around 8:10 a.m. sharp, Eugene Marshall pushed through the door like clockwork. He didn't make much noise when he came in. No grand entrance, just a slight nod to whoever looked up, and a quiet, "Morning, Lou," even though Lou hadn't owned the place in years. Eugene always took the same booth, second one by the window, close enough to feel the morning light, far enough to be left alone. He wore his army jacket, not a flashy new kind, but the old olive-drab M65 he'd had since '69. It still fit, though the fabric was thinned and the sleeves frayed. On the back, just below the collar, was a faded patch stitched by hand. The letters 101st. The Screaming Eagles. Some folks thought he wore it for attention. Truth was, it was the only jacket that still felt right on his back. He sat, adjusted the sugar dispenser out of habit, and waited. No menu. Everyone in that diner knew what Eugene wanted. Black coffee, no sugar, no cream. And a warm slice of apple pie, slightly burnt on the edges, just the way he liked it. The waitresses knew to give him space. So did most of the regulars, not out of fear, but respect. Eugene didn't talk much, but when he did, he chose his words like someone who'd spent a lifetime learning when to speak and when to keep still. At 78, his eyes were sharper than his knees. Arthritis had started stealing his walk, but not his posture. He still sat like a soldier, back straight, head level, hands steady. Every now and then, a curious kid would ask about the patches on his jacket. Eugene would smile, lean down, and tell a short story, always one that ended in someone else being brave. He never made himself the hero, but on that particular Sunday, something felt slightly off. Luis Camargo, the 26-year-old son of the current owner, peeked from the kitchen. He liked Eugene, always gave him an extra scoop of apples when no one was looking. Eugene had told him once, "Boy, if your kitchen had legs, I'd marry it." They both laughed for about 5 minutes over that. The place wasn't too busy yet. A couple reading the paper, a mother trying to keep her toddler quiet with a stack of napkins, and an older man halfway through his grits and gravy. Just another morning. Eugene stirred his coffee. The pie arrived. He took a bite, leaned back, eyes half closed, and for a few seconds he wasn't in Bakersfield anymore. He was somewhere quieter, maybe younger. But before the second bite, the front door swung open fast. Not just open, but loud. One of those look-at-me entrances. 3 men walked in. Young, mid-20s, all sneakers and swagger, laughter too loud for the size of the room. One wore a puffer jacket despite the warm weather. Another had a Bluetooth speaker clipped to his belt, playing music nobody asked for. Luis looked up from the kitchen window, brow furrowed. The men laughed and shouted something about old heads hogging booths. One pointed straight at Eugene. And that's when the whole diner shifted. But nobody spoke up yet. Not the customers, not the staff. Everyone just waited. They were the type of guys you could hear before you saw. The leader, or at least the loudest, was a guy with a backwards hat and a permanent smirk. His name, they'd later find out, was Troy Delaney. Next to him was Reggie Finn, taller, skinnier, always bouncing like he had too much sugar in his veins. The third one, Darnell Holmes, wore sunglasses indoors and talked like every sentence was a dare. Troy looked around the diner like he owned it. His eyes landed on Eugene, and stayed there. "Damn, y'all see Grandpa G.I. Joe?" he said, pointing toward Eugene's booth. "Bet he stormed Normandy with a cane," Reggie cracked up. Man probably thinks this place still takes war rations. A few people chuckled nervously. Most just looked down at their plates, hoping the noise would pass like bad weather. Eugene didn't flinch. He reached for his coffee again, hands steady. Took a sip. The heat didn't seem to bother him. Luis Camargo leaned forward in the kitchen window. His jaw was tight. He didn't like the tone, but he was waiting. Watching. Trying to see if the men would settle or if they came to rattle the peace on purpose. Troy walked right past the first row of booths and leaned on Eugene's table with one hand. "Hey, Pops, what's with the army costume? You playing dress-up this morning?" Reggie laughed. "Yeah, tell us a story, old man. Did you wrestle Hitler yourself or just babysit the tanks?" Darnell stayed back by the jukebox, not playing anything, just pretending to scroll like he wasn't involved. But he was. They always traveled in threes, one to stir, one to echo, one to fake innocence. Eugene finally looked up. His eyes weren't angry, just clear. Still. Quiet in a way that made you think twice. "You boys got nothing better to do?" he asked, voice low but firm. Troy tilted his head. "We're just talking. Freedom of speech, right, soldier?" Luis had heard enough. He wiped his hands, came through the swinging door, and walked to the counter without saying anything. The waitress, Marcy, a woman in her 60s with nerves like piano wire, looked at him, then looked away. Eugene set down his fork and leaned back slightly. "You get your laughs messing with old folks?" he asked, not breaking eye contact. "Nah," Troy said, chuckling. "Just trying to understand why someone still wears that dusty-ass jacket like it means something." Someone in the booth behind Eugene muttered, "It does mean something, idiot." Troy turned. "What was that?" he snapped. Nobody answered. Luis came around the counter slowly, walking toward Eugene's booth. Darnell, by the jukebox, finally spoke. "Man, y'all trippin'. He ain't even doing nothing. Just some old vet stuck in the past. Let it go." Reggie stepped closer to Eugene now. Too close. The energy shifted. People could feel it. The difference between teasing and tension. Reggie tapped the table. "What's the matter? Can't hear us? You got war flashbacks or something? Want to cry on your pie?" Luis stopped just behind Eugene's booth. His hands were clenched. Voice low but sharp. "That's enough." Troy turned. "Who are you?" "His grandson." Luis didn't answer that. He stepped forward and stood beside Eugene. "Do you know who this is?" he asked. Troy blinked. "What, like he's some celebrity?" Luis didn't say anything. He looked at Eugene. Eugene didn't look away. Silence rolled across the diner like thunder with no lightning. Everyone stopped pretending they weren't watching. Luis looked at Reggie, then Troy, then Darnell. "You want to clown on somebody, fine. Do it outside. But you do not come in here and disrespect this man," Reggie scoffed. "What, he your dad or something?" Luis turned slightly. His voice was still calm. "No, but I'd be lucky if he was." Eugene raised his hand slightly. "Let them talk," he said quietly. "Sometimes ignorance needs an audience before it can embarrass itself." Troy chuckled again, but the laugh didn't have the same punch. Something was shifting. The crowd wasn't on their side anymore. At a table near the window, an older white man set down his paper. "That man saved my cousin's life in Vietnam," he said. A woman at the counter turned around. "Mine too," she added. "He dragged him through the jungle for 2 days after he got hit. Lost half his own blood doing it." Even Marcy, the waitress, stepped forward. "You boys have no idea who you're messing with." But the 3 men didn't leave. Not yet. Because they hadn't heard the whole story. Troy stepped back, eyes darting across the room. The change in the air wasn't subtle anymore. It pressed against his ego like a closed door. People weren't laughing with him. They were watching him. Still, he wasn't ready to let go. "Oh, so now this place worships old soldiers," he said, louder than before, trying to take control again. "Man wears a jacket and suddenly he's a superhero?" Reggie laughed again, but it was forced now. He looked at Eugene, then around at the customers. His confidence was starting to slip. Darnell still hadn't moved from the jukebox. But even he had stopped pretending to scroll. His arms were crossed now, jaw tight. Watching. Eugene exhaled slowly, folded his napkin, and placed it beside his plate. He looked up at Troy with that same level gaze. "You ever been shot at, son?" he asked. "Ever held a friend while he bled out in the mud and called for a mother he hadn't seen in years?" Troy didn't answer. "Didn't think so," Eugene said, soft but pointed. "So maybe you ought to be quiet before you embarrass yourself further." Troy clenched his jaw, glancing at the door like he was calculating whether it was worth walking out now or pushing further. Reggie leaned in toward Eugene's booth, resting his palms on the table like he was about to deliver some kind of clever insult. "Man, you think just 'cause you fought in some war that people owe you something? Nobody asked you to sign up." Luis stepped closer, eyes sharp now. "He didn't ask for anything, but you owe him more than you'll ever understand." "Oh, please," Troy scoffed. "Let me guess. Now comes the sob story. War hero comes back, gets no respect, fights racism, all that." That's when a voice from the corner booth cut in. "You little punks have no idea what he fought when he came home," said a woman in her 70s with tightly curled grey hair and a leopard print scarf around her neck. "You think coming back to Bakersfield after Vietnam was a celebration? He came back to hate, spit on his boots, doors slammed in his face. He fought one war for this country, then came home to fight another." Eugene didn't interrupt. He sat still, listening. Luis added, "You ever get denied a job because of a uniform you wore? You ever have to drink from a separate fountain after risking your life for people who wouldn't even share a sidewalk with you?" Troy looked uncomfortable now. The smirk faded. Reggie stepped back slightly. "Man, you're making this real dramatic." Marcy raised her voice from behind the counter. "It is dramatic. It's life. You boys wouldn't last 10 minutes in Eugene's shoes." Darnell finally moved. He stepped forward, slow and deliberate, his sunglasses still on. He stopped just short of Eugene's booth. "All right, fine," he said. "He's a vet. He went through some stuff. That still don't give him a pass to walk around like the world owes him." Eugene looked up at him, but his voice remained calm. "I never asked the world for anything," he said. "I just came here to enjoy a slice of pie, like I've done every Sunday for 19 years. The fact that my presence makes you feel small, that's not on me. That's on you." Luis crossed his arms. "You boys wanted attention. Now you've got it. And from the look of things, you don't know what to do with it." A man near the window stood up. He had one leg and moved with crutches. His voice cracked slightly. "Eugene pulled me out of a collapsed building in Hugh City. I was 19. He could have saved himself. Instead, he came back for me." He tapped one crutch on the floor. "So yeah, I'd say he's earned a little respect." The silence that followed was heavy. Troy looked around. Nobody was with him anymore, not even Reggie or Darnell, who had both turned inward, like kids caught lying. Eugene finally pushed his plate away. He wasn't finished eating, but it didn't matter. "I don't wear this jacket for the attention," he said, brushing a crumb off the sleeve. "I wear it because of the men who never made it home to take theirs off." But he still hadn't told them the part of his story that would change everything. The room was quiet now. Not just quiet, but tense in the way people feel when something heavy is hanging in the air. Nobody ate. Nobody moved. The hum of the overhead light was the only thing filling the silence, but even that seemed too loud. All eyes were on Eugene, and the three men who'd walked in thinking they owned the place. Luis stood beside Eugene, arms folded, his jaw tight, but his eyes steady. He wasn't just standing up for a customer. This was personal. He remembered being 12, watching Eugene patch up a flat tire for his mother in the middle of a heat wave, without asking for anything in return. Back then, Eugene was just Mr. Marshall from down the street. Luis hadn't known about the war, the medals, the years spent rebuilding a life that had been ripped apart twice, once overseas, and again when he came home. Troy rubbed the back of his neck, fidgeting. His bravado had cracked, but his pride wouldn't let him walk out. Not yet. He motioned toward the jacket again. "Man, you keep talking like you're some kind of legend or something." A heavy voice from behind them spoke. It was the cook, Ramon Espinosa, usually kept to himself. didn't talk unless it was about food. But now he stepped out of the kitchen, apron still on, flour on his arms. "Legend?" Ramon said. "He is?" Troy turned, brows raised. "You're like baseball?" Ramon asked. Reggie shrugged. "Yeah, so? You know the name Vernon Dorsey?" Reggie blinked. "Yeah. Pitcher from back in the day, right? He was my cousin," Ramon said. "First black kid to play at Stockdale High. Got drafted, never came back. You know why?" Troy didn't answer. "Because a landmine took off half his chest. Eugene was the one who carried what was left of him back to the medic tent. Stayed by his side. Held his hand while he died. Wrote a letter to our family. Sent his dog tags home." Ramon's voice cracked but didn't break. "My uncle kept that letter in his Bible until the day he passed." Eugene didn't speak. He just looked down at his coffee, now cold. Darnell shifted on his feet. "All right. Okay. We get it." "No, you don't," Marcy said from behind the counter. "You think you get to walk into a place like this, toss insults, and laugh at a man who's lived through more than you can even imagine? Let me tell you something. This man," she pointed at Eugene, "this man lost more friends in 1 year than you'll ever make in a lifetime." Even people who hadn't spoken up earlier were nodding now, making eye contact for the first time. The walls of silence were cracking. And the diner? This old, run-down place that usually just served eggs and gossip had turned into something else entirely. Troy looked like he was about to speak again, but Luis cut him off. "You boys wanted to show off. Okay, you walked in loud. You thought nobody would say anything. Maybe that's what you're used to. But this isn't that kind of place," Reggie mumbled. "Man, we didn't know." Luis raised a hand. "You didn't want to know. That's different." Eugene finally looked up again. "You ever wonder what happens when someone who's been through hell decides to live in peace, and then gets mocked for it?" Troy looked away. Eugene continued, "It's not just the disrespect. It's the reminder that no matter how much you give, some folks will always try to measure you by what they think they see." Luis turned toward the kitchen for a moment, and then looked back at Eugene. "Should I tell them about the photo?" Eugene shook his head slightly. "No need. They wouldn't understand it anyway." "What photo?" Darnell asked, sounding more cautious now. Luis hesitated. "There's a picture in my dad's safe. From '72. Eugene carrying a wounded child through a burning village. The kid's barefoot. Blood everywhere. Eugene's face is calm. Focused. That picture's in a frame, under glass. It's the only thing my dad took when we moved from our first restaurant to here." He looked at the 3 men. "That kid was my uncle." A beat of silence passed. "You saved his life," Luis said to Eugene. "He lived long enough to have a family. That includes me." But they still hadn't heard what Eugene lost, the part that had never made it into any letter or photograph. For a moment, no one said a word. The weight in the air was no longer about anger. It had shifted to something heavier, more personal. There was a quiet ache now, something in the way people looked at Eugene that wasn't just about respect. It was sorrow, regret. Louise pulled out a chair beside Eugene's booth but didn't sit. He rested one hand on the back of it, as if grounding himself. "There's something else," he said, looking toward the front of the diner. "Something none of you asked. But you should have." Eugene sighed softly. He didn't want this part told, but it was too late now. Luis wasn't trying to embarrass him. He was trying to make them understand. "He had a wife," Luis said. "Her name was Margaret. She used to come in with him sometimes, years back. Sweet lady. Wore this gold bracelet every Sunday, even though it was missing a stone. Told me it was a gift from Eugene before he shipped out." Eugene didn't raise his eyes. His hands were flat on the table now. "She waited for him through 2 tours. Luis continued. "Held the house together, worked nights, saved pennies just to buy a second-hand crib before he came home. She thought they were going to start a family." He paused. "But Margaret died the day before Eugene returned. Car accident on Union Avenue. A drunk driver blew through a red light. She was coming home from her shift. He didn't even know she was gone until he stepped off the bus and a neighbor met him with the news." A few gasps escaped from the booths. Eugene slowly leaned back, pressing his shoulders into the vinyl. "We'd picked out the baby's name," he said, his voice low, almost like he was talking to himself. "Girl or boy. It was going to be Jordan. We didn't care. Just wanted the child healthy." He swallowed hard. "I missed the funeral by 3 hours. Plane delays out of Saigon. I never even got to say goodbye. For the first time since the whole exchange began." Troy's expression changed. He blinked fast, lips slightly parted. Reggie looked away completely. Darnell rubbed his hand over his mouth. Marcy stepped out from behind the counter and brought Eugene a fresh cup of coffee. She didn't say anything, just placed it gently on the table and gave his shoulder a quiet squeeze. Luis looked at the three men. "So when you laugh at that jacket, when you call him names, when you act like his presence here is some kind of joke, you're mocking a man who already gave more than you'll ever be asked to." Troy finally spoke, but the confidence was gone. I didn't know all that, man." Eugene gave a soft, tired laugh. "No, you didn't. You didn't want to." There was a pause, heavy and long. Then the old man with the crutches from earlier said, "You didn't know because you never thought to ask. That's the problem. You assume, then you mock, but you never listen." The woman with the leopard scarf added, "You boys are lucky. You grew up in a world where people like Eugene made it safer for you to act like fools." Reggie whispered, "We were just messing around. Didn't mean it like that." Eugene looked up. His eyes weren't angry, just deeply tired. "I fought so people could speak freely," he said. "But I didn't fight so they could forget the cost." That hit harder than any shout could have. Luis nodded slowly. "Exactly." Troy shifted awkwardly. "Look, I'm sorry, all right?" Eugene didn't reply right away. He studied the young man, like he was trying to figure out if the apology was real or just an escape hatch. "Don't say sorry if you're only saying it because you got caught," he said. "Say it if you're going to carry the truth with you after you walk out that door." Troy's mouth opened, then closed. He gave a slow, reluctant nod. Reggie, now clearly shaken, said, "I had no clue about any of this." "I swear," Darnell added. "Me neither. We were just being dumb." Eugene's hand rested on the rim of the coffee cup. "Being dumb is one thing," he said. "Choosing to stay that way, that's another." But this wasn't the end. The final moment, the real turning point, was still coming. Troy was quiet now. Reggie stood a little behind him, looking down at the floor like he wished it would open up and swallow him whole. Darnell leaned against the jukebox, arms folded tight, sunglasses still on, but he wasn't hiding anything anymore. Not anger, not defiance, just confusion and shame. The diner had flipped. They came in laughing. Now they looked like kids who'd been told off in front of the whole school, not with yelling, but with truth. And truth stings worse when you realize you walked right into it by choice. Eugene took a sip from the new coffee Marcy had brought him. He didn't flinch. He never flinched. His hands were still steady, even though the past had just been opened up like an old wound in front of strangers. But something was different now. The silence didn't feel like tension anymore. It felt like respect, real respect, the kind that doesn't need to be announced. Troy cleared his throat. "Mr. Marshall," he said, voice low. "I'm sorry. I mean it." Eugene nodded once, just slightly. Reggie stepped forward. "We shouldn't have said what we said. We didn't know your story. That don't excuse it, I know. But still." Luis stood quietly, still next to Eugene, arms crossed. "You came in here looking to laugh at someone," Luis said. "That was the goal? You weren't just having fun. You were trying to knock someone down to feel taller." Reggie didn't argue. "I know. And the thing is," Luis continued, "you picked the wrong man. Not because he's untouchable, not because he's some legend carved in stone, but because he's already been through more than you can throw at him. And he carried it with dignity." Darnell finally stepped forward. "We came in acting stupid. That's on us. I get it now." The old man with the crutches chuckled once. "You get it now because the whole town's staring at you." That stung, but it wasn't cruel. It was honest. Then something unexpected happened. A teenage girl from one of the back booths, maybe 17, in a hoodie and Vans, stood up and walked over to Eugene's table. She pulled something from her backpack, a small notebook. She opened it to a half-filled page and held it out. "Would you mind writing down your name?" she asked. "I want to remember it." Eugene looked at her, surprised. He took the notebook, flipped it gently in his hands like it was made of glass, then took Marcy's pen from the table. He didn't just sign. He wrote, "Eugene Marshall, Infantry, 101st Airborne Division." Then he handed it back. The girl clutched it like it was a concert ticket to a better future and sat back down without another word. The whole room softened after that. People weren't whispering anymore. They weren't frozen. They were looking at Eugene differently, not as a ghost from the past, but as someone they finally saw, fully. Louise let out a breath and looked toward Troy, Reggie, and Darnell. "So, what now?" he asked. Troy glanced around the room. "We leave?" Louise gave a slow nod. "That'd be best." They turned toward the door. Darnell went first. Reggie followed, his shoulders slumped. Troy hesitated. He turned back one last time. "If you ever wanted to talk to someone," he said, looking at Eugene, "or maybe even tell more of your story, I'd listen." Eugene gave a slow smile, the kind that didn't quite reach the eyes, but said everything it needed to. "Then maybe you should start by listening to the folks around you," he said. "There's stories all over this place. Just takes ears and humility." Troy gave a faint nod, and finally walked out. The bell on the door jingled behind them. This time they didn't slam it. They closed it gently. Louise turned to Eugene. "You all right?" Eugene glanced out the window. The sky had shifted a little. The light wasn't so sharp anymore. "I'm fine," he said. "Didn't plan on a history lesson today, but I guess life had other ideas." But there was still one more thing Eugene needed to say, and it wasn't for the boys who left. It was for everyone else who stayed. After the door shut behind the boys, a different kind of silence settled over Lou's diner. It wasn't tense. It wasn't awkward. It was respectful. Like everyone knew something meaningful had just happened, but nobody wanted to be the first to say it out loud. Eugene sat back in his booth, his pie mostly untouched. He didn't look angry. He didn't even look tired anymore. Just still, like a man who knew exactly where he stood. Louise stepped away from the table, giving him space, but he stayed close just in case Eugene wanted to say more. And Eugene did. He reached for his cup, took one last sip of the now lukewarm coffee, and then set it down. His voice, when he spoke, wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. "You know," he said, eyes sweeping across the room, "when I came home in 72, I didn't expect a parade. I'd seen too much to care about flags and speeches. All I wanted was peace, just a quiet life, a job, a family." He paused, then looked down at his plate. "But peace didn't come easy. I wore this same jacket back then, not because I wanted attention, but because it was the only thing I owned that hadn't been taken from me. And every time I walked into a store or sat on a bench, somebody would look at me like I didn't belong." A murmur passed through the diner. Heads nodded. Faces tightened. "Sometimes," Eugene continued, "they called me names. Sometimes they crossed the street, but most times they said nothing at all. That silence? That's worse than words. Because it means they've already decided you ain't worth the breath." He looked up again, locking eyes with no one in particular and everyone all at once. "And I learned something back then. You can't make people respect you. You can only live in a way that demands it, not by force but by truth, by standing when it's easier to sit, by walking away when your pride begs you to swing." A woman near the window wiped her eye with a napkin. "Those boys, they were just noise. I've heard louder. I've faced worse. But what hurts isn't the jokes or the ignorance. It's how easy it is for everyone else to sit and say nothing. How fast we all pretend we don't hear." He glanced at Marcy, who looked back with glassy eyes. "Don't get me wrong. I'm not angry. I've lived long enough to know that anger's a fire that eats the one holding it. But I am disappointed." Marcy stepped closer. "We should have said something sooner," she said. "I should have." Eugene shook his head gently. "I'm not here to scold anyone. That's not why I come here every Sunday. I come for the pie. And the quiet. But maybe quiet ain't always what we need. Luis spoke up from behind the counter. Maybe we need to be louder for the right reasons. Eugene gave a small smile. Exactly. Then he turned to the younger customers still seated. The girl with the notebook, a couple of college kids near the back, a boy who looked about 16 staring wide-eyed. You don't have to go to war to be brave, he said. Sometimes it's brave just to speak up when someone's being torn down, even if it ain't you. Especially when it ain't you. The boy at the back nodded slowly, like he was absorbing every word. And one day, Eugene added, when you see someone getting laughed at for something they didn't choose, their age, their skin, their story, you'll remember this morning. You'll remember how fast things can turn, how small cruelty really looks when truth walks into the room. He looked at his half-eaten pie, then back up again. Now, he said, brushing his hands on his pants. If nobody minds, I'd like to finish my breakfast. That got a few quiet laughs. Not forced, not awkward, real. And just like that, the tension finally broke. But outside those walls, word was already starting to spread, and the lesson wasn't going to stay inside Lou's diner for long. It didn't take long. By the time the lunch crowd began trickling into Lou's diner, whispers had already spread beyond its walls. Someone posted a blurry photo of Eugene sitting in his booth, with Luis standing beside him, and a caption that read, "This man just shut down 3 bullies without raising his voice." It got shared, reposted, quoted. People didn't know the full story, but they felt something in the image, a kind of stillness that carried weight. Across town in barbershops and church basements, the story unfolded in bits and pieces. The old vet, the loud kids, the moment the diner stood up. People leaned closer to hear the details. Names were passed around, not just Eugene's, but Troy Delaney's too. And not in a flattering way. By early evening, Troy was already dealing with the fallout. His aunt called him, not to ask, but to tell him what she'd heard. A co-worker brought it up at his job at the warehouse, and one of his old high school coaches sent a message. "What you did in that diner, you better fix that, son, or you'll carry it a long time." Troy sat alone in his car that night, outside a Taco Bell, watching the screen on his phone light up with notifications he didn't want to read. Regret was a slow burn. He thought about going back to Lou's, maybe tomorrow, maybe with his mother, maybe say something face to face. He wasn't sure if it would matter. Back at the diner, Eugene had finished his meal hours ago. He was long gone. But the booth stayed empty for the rest of the day. Nobody sat there, not out of fear, but because it felt wrong. Like touching something sacred. Marcy wiped it down twice anyway, humming quietly to herself, like she was clearing out more than crumbs. Louise stayed late, long after close. He sat at the counter, elbows on the formica, turning the events over in his head. "You all right?" Marcy asked him. He nodded slowly. "Yeah, just thinking. About Eugene?" "About all of it." She poured him a coffee, even though he hadn't asked. "Set it down gently." "We see so much these days," she said. "Videos, posts, headlines. But it's different when it happens right in front of you." Louise stared at the dark liquid in his cup. "It made me realize how many times I've stayed quiet," he said. Marcy didn't say anything right away. Then she whispered, "We all have." They sat like that for a few minutes. The clink of a spoon here, the creak of a chair there. Bakersfield wasn't known for its grand moments, but today felt bigger than usual. And across town, something else was happening. The girl with the notebook, her name was Hannah Rhodes, posted Eugene's quote online. The one about not needing to go to war to be brave. Within hours, teachers were sharing it. A veterans group reposted it. Someone printed it on a flyer and tacked it to the library bulletin board. People didn't know Eugene's whole story, but they felt the truth in his words. And in a small way, that truth started moving. It moved into the way folks greeted each other that week. With more care. A little slower. It moved into how the regulars at Lou's treated the waitstaff. More tips, more thank yous. It even moved into a high school history class where a student named Andre pulled up Eugene's photo and said, "Can we talk about people like him for a change?" Back at Eugene's house, things were quiet. He lived alone, in a one-story home with peeling paint and a porch that creaked in all the right places. That night, he sat in his recliner, jacket folded neatly over the back, sipping tea instead of coffee. He didn't know how many people had seen his face, didn't know about the posts or the comments or the sudden rise in his name being Googled. He didn't care. What mattered to him was simpler. That someone, maybe just one person, would carry what happened today into how they treated the next stranger they met. Because respect isn't a trend, and kindness doesn't need a camera. But the story wasn't quite finished, because what happened next would prove the lesson had stuck. By Thursday, the story had taken on a life of its own. Eugene didn't have social media. He barely used his flip phone, but when he went out to pick up his prescription at the local pharmacy, the cashier, a young man with tattoos and a nervous smile, gave him his receipt and said, "Thank you for what you did, Mr. Marshall." Eugene blinked. "What did I do?" The kid smiled wider. "You stood up without raising your voice. My mom told me the story. She said she cried when she read it." Eugene gave a small shake of the head and took his bag. "I just had breakfast, but the truth was, things were different now." At the grocery store, a woman in scrubs handed him a card with no words, just a folded note that read, "You reminded me how powerful quiet strength can be." Outside the post office, an older man in a denim jacket saluted him. It was stiff, not military perfect, but it meant something. And at Lou's Diner the following Sunday, his usual booth was already cleared, napkin and all. Marcy had even added a small vase with a single white lily. "Don't get used to flowers," she joked. "You ain't royalty," but everyone could tell. Something had changed. Eugene slid into the booth like always, but this time, when people looked, they didn't look away. They nodded, spoke, asked. A man in his 30s approached him cautiously, a little boy trailing behind. "Mr. Marshall?" "Yes. I just wanted to say thank you for the way you handled those kids. My son saw the video clip online. I used it to talk to him about standing up without stooping low." Eugene glanced at the boy. "What's your name?" "Caleb," the kid said shyly. "You treat people right, Caleb." The boy nodded. "I try." Eugene smiled. "Keep doing that. Trying's the whole point." The man shook his hand, firm, grateful, and left with his son. Luis brought over Eugene's pie and coffee, same as always. But this time, he slid into the booth across from him. "You all right?" he asked. Eugene nodded. "Seems like I started something I didn't mean to." Luis grinned. Maybe it was meant to start. They sat in quiet for a while. Then Eugene asked, "How's your uncle doing?" Luis blinked. "You remember that?" "Of course. He's good. Retired last year. Still talks about that picture. Still tells people how you saved his life." Eugene looked out the window. "We were both lucky that day." A few booths over, the girl with the notebook, Hannah, waved at Eugene. He gave a slight wave back. Luis looked at her. "She's been coming in every day since Sunday. Said she wants to talk to you more. Learn about what it means to carry something heavy and still walk tall." Eugene chuckled. "Tell her to bring stronger shoes." Later that week, Lou's hosted a small veterans' breakfast. Nothing fancy, no speeches, just pancakes, sausage, and good company. Eugene showed up last, of course, but when he walked in, every person in the room stood up. Not in show, in recognition. Even Troy was there, quiet in the back. He didn't try to talk, just stood, head low, hands in his pockets. At one point, he walked over and placed a folded envelope on Eugene's table, then turned and left. Inside was a note. "I disrespected someone who deserved more than I'll ever understand. I'm sorry. I'm not asking for forgiveness. Just hoping I can be better. TD." Eugene read it twice, folded it back, and placed it inside his jacket pocket. He didn't need to frame it. He didn't need to respond. The words were enough. And from that moment on, there wasn't a Sunday when Eugene sat alone again. People came, listened, asked, and not just about Vietnam, about life, about grief, about how to survive when the world feels too sharp and too loud. He didn't have answers for everything, but he had stories, and sometimes that was more than enough. But one last moment, quiet, almost missed, would carry the lesson even further than Eugene ever expected. A week later, Bakersfield High School held its annual assembly for Veterans Day. Normally, it was a modest event. A few words from the principal, maybe a slideshow with stock images, and a handful of half-listening students itching to get back to class. But this year felt different. It started with a simple email from a history teacher named Mr. Langford, who'd heard about Eugene from one of his students, Hannah, the girl with the notebook. She told him what happened at Lou's, showed him the quote Eugene had written. He'd read it twice, then again a third time. Something about it felt honest in a way textbooks rarely did. Mr. Langford made a call, then another. By the end of the week, a guest chair had been set at center stage. Eugene didn't say yes right away. He didn't care for crowds. He didn't think of himself as a speaker. But when Hannah showed up at his porch with a note from the class, handwritten messages in different inks and uneven handwriting, all asking him to come, he felt something shift. So he said yes. On the morning of the assembly, Luis offered to drive him, but Eugene wanted to walk in on his own. Jacket pressed, shoes shined. That same quiet posture, back straight, shoulders square. As he stepped into the auditorium, a hush fell over the students. Not because he looked like a celebrity, but because there was something about the way he carried himself that made even the most restless kid sit up a little straighter. He took his seat slowly, waited his turn. When the principal called his name, there was a beat of hesitation. Then applause, quiet at first, but building. Not thunderous, just real. Eugene walked up to the mic, adjusted it, looked out at the rows of faces, most of them young, uncertain, half curious. He didn't use notes. "I don't have much to say," he began. "But I've got a few things worth hearing." Silence. "I wore this jacket in a war. But it's not the war that defined me. It's what came after," he told them, in simple words about coming home, about losing his wife, about walking into diners and being ignored, about learning how to carry grief without letting it crush you. And then he looked straight at the front row. "You don't have to wear a uniform to serve. You don't need a title to do the right thing. All it takes is paying attention, listening, speaking up when it's easier to stay quiet." A boy in the back lowered his phone. A girl near the front wiped her cheek. "I didn't come here to be honored," Eugene said. "I came here hoping you'll walk out of this room and remember one thing. You don't build respect by talking louder than everyone else. You build it by standing still when someone else needs support." The room stayed quiet long after he finished. No fireworks, no loud music, just students rising to their feet, some clapping, some thinking. Afterward, Hannah walked up with her notebook. "Can I quote that last part?" she asked. Eugene smiled. "Only if you write it in pen." Outside, Luis was waiting in the parking lot. He opened the passenger door, but Eugene paused. Across the street, 3 boys were standing at the bus stop. One of them was Troy. He saw Eugene, hesitated, then gave a small wave. No swagger, no grin. Just a wave. Eugene nodded, nothing more. Luis pulled onto the main road as the sun dropped behind the buildings. "Never seen a room so quiet," he said. "They were listening," Eugene replied. Luis glanced at him. "Feels like something stuck." Eugene looked out the window. "That's the hope." And that was it. No cameras, no headlines, just a moment that meant something. And in a town where people once walked past Eugene without a second glance, now they paused. Now they remembered. Now they carried his words, not because he demanded it, but because he earned it. Sometimes the most powerful voice in the room isn't the loudest one. It's the one that speaks with quiet truth and walks away without needing applause. If this story moved you, even a little, take a second. Speak to someone who's been overlooked. Stand up when it's easier to sit down, and if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button. Because more stories like Eugene's deserve to be heard and remembered.